The door of the Graves ranch house closed with the solid final sound of oiled oak meeting its frame. It was a sound Ilara had once found comforting, a sound that meant home and safety. Now, it was the sound of her world ending. On the other side of that door was everything she had known for 2 years. Inside was the warmth of the hearth, the smell of baking bread, the memory of her husband, Thomas. Outside, there was only the biting wind of late autumn and the stony face of her father-in-law. Mr. Graves stood on the porch, a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that ringed the valley. His face, weathered by sun and authority, showed no grief for his dead son, only a cold, settled fury directed at the young woman before him. He was the Baron of Promise Creek, his cattle empire sprawling across 1,000 hills. His word was law, his judgment absolute.
"He was soft," Graves said, his voice low and grinding, like stones in a riverbed. "You made him soft. A man of his station, wasting his time on books and sketches with you, instead of learning the brand and the herd." He did not need to say the rest. Thomas had died of a fever that swept through the valley. But in his father's mind, the cause was a weakness of character, a sickness Ilara had introduced. She stood before him, 19 years old, a widow of 3 days. She wore the only black dress she owned, now dusty from the road. She did not weep. Her tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her chest, a solid block of ice that left no room for breath. She simply waited for the sentence to be carried out. From his pocket, he produced a small leather pouch and a folded piece of paper. He pressed them into her palm. His touch was cold, impersonal. $50, he stated, not as a gift, but as a transaction. And the deed. It was my grandfather's first claim, a worthless spit of rock up on the North Ridge. They call it the Fissure. The name was a local legend, a place of bad luck and chilling drafts, a jagged scar in the face of the mountain where nothing grew and no animal wintered. It was an insult, given the legal weight of a deed. It was his final public dismissal of her, a way of telling the entire valley that she was worth less than nothing. "You will not use my son's name," he commanded. "You are not a Graves. You will leave Promise Creek. Go east, find work in a mill. I do not care. But you will not be a burden here." He turned without another word, the heavy oak door swinging open and closing once more, sealing her out forever. The injustice of it was a physical blow, a strike that left her breathless in the cold air. Ilara stood there for a long moment, the pouch and the paper clutched in her hand. The townspeople of Promise Creek, who had gathered at a distance to watch the drama unfold, began to disperse. Some shot her looks of pity, others of cold satisfaction. Mr. Finch, the owner of the mercantile, approached her, his expression one of weary condescension. "A sad day, girl," he said, shaking his head. "There's a wagon heading east at dawn. For $5 you could be on it. Best to take it. There's nothing for you here." She looked at the man's face, at the faint, smug certainty in his eyes. She looked past him, to the distant, jagged line of the North Ridge. She felt the $50, a meager weight in her palm. It was not enough for a new life, but it was too much for a surrender. A quiet, cold resolve settled over her, displacing the shock. They expected her to run. They expected her to break. She turned her back on Mr. Finch, on the imposing ranch house, on the whole of Promise Creek. She did not walk toward the road that led east. Instead, she walked toward the mercantile, her steps measured and deliberate. She would not flee. She would not become a ghost in their memory. She would go to the worthless land. She would take their insult and make it her home. The journey to the North Ridge was a punishment. The trail that wound up from the valley floor was little more than a goat path, steep
and treacherous. Elara carried her life on her back. A canvas sack containing a heavy wool blanket, a small iron pot, a bag of flour, a packet of salt, and the axe she had spent 3 of her precious dollars on. The axe was her one true investment, its hickory handle smooth and promising, its steel head sharp and heavy. The weight of it all pressed down on her, a constant reminder of how little she had. For 2 days she climbed, the lush valley giving way to sparse pine, and then to barren, wind-swept rock. The air grew thinner, colder. The silence was absolute, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling high above and the scrape of her boots on stone. She was utterly alone, the town of Promise Creek a distant memory below. The isolation was a physical presence, a cold cloak that settled around her shoulders. Finally, she reached the land described on the deed. It was worse than the stories. The fissure was a violent gash in the face of a granite cliff, a deep, shadowed crack running 100 feet long and plunging into darkness. The land around it was a chaotic jumble of shattered rock and scree. No trees grew here, only stunted, hardy bushes clinging to life in the crevices. The wind howled across the ridge, a relentless, predatory thing that seemed to claw at her clothes and steal the warmth from her bones. She dropped her sack, her knees weak with exhaustion and a sudden, overwhelming wave of despair. This was it. This was her inheritance. A hole in the ground. The town was right. Mr. Graves was right. It was a place to die, not to live. The cold dread she had felt on the porch returned, sharp and acidic. Tears finally stung her eyes, hot against her frozen cheeks. For a single, terrifying moment, she saw her own future. A skeleton picked clean by vultures at the bottom of that dark crack. She sat on a cold stone, her head in her hands, the wind screaming its victory around her. The world had stripped her of everything, her husband, her home, her name, and left her here to be erased. She stayed that way for what felt like an hour, numb and defeated. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, a different kind of cold began to creep in. It was the cold of a night spent in the open, a cold that did not just chill, but killed. Survival, a primal instinct she did not know she possessed, began to stir. She had to get out of the wind. She scrambled toward the cliff face, seeking shelter against the stone. As she neared the mouth of the fissure, she noticed something strange. The howling of the wind lessened. Here, in the lee of the great rock, the air was almost still. She took another step closer, her hand outstretched to brace herself against the stone wall beside the crack. And then she felt it, a faint but unmistakable sensation. The air that touched her face was not the biting, frigid air of the ridge. It was cool, but not cold. There was a gentleness to it, a lack of hostility. She moved closer, putting her hand directly in front of the dark opening of the fissure. A steady, slow current of air breathed out from the darkness. It was warmer than the outside air, significantly warmer. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her despair. She knelt, her face close to the rock. The draft was constant, a quiet exhalation from the deep earth. Geothermal warmth. A legend she'd heard miners talk about, of deep veins in the earth that never froze. The worthless, haunted fissure was breathing. It was alive, and it was warm. In that moment, her despair did not vanish, but it transformed. It hardened into a grim, unyielding resolve. This place was not her grave, it was her foundation. The first task was shelter. Not a home, but a shield against the wind and the coming night. Using the last of the daylight, Ilara dragged fallen slabs of granite, stacking them into a low, crude wall across a small alcove next to the main fissure. It was brutal, clumsy work. The stone was heavy, its edges sharp like knives. Her hands, soft from 2 years of a gentle life, were quickly scraped raw. Muscles she didn't know she had screamed in protest. She roofed the small space with a thick, gnarled pine branch she found wedged in the rocks below, piling smaller stones and sod on top of it. By the time darkness fell completely, she had a lean-to no bigger than a coffin, but it blocked the wind. She crawled inside, pulling her blanket around her, and huddled against the cliff face. The stone beside the fissure was not warm to the touch, but it was not leaching the life from her either. It was neutral, a barrier against the killing cold. She did not sleep, but she survived the night. The next days blurred into a single, agonizing cycle of labor. Her body became a machine, fueled by fistfuls of flour mixed with water into a pasty dough, cooked on a flat stone over a tiny, precious fire. Her first major project was to improve her shelter. She needed walls, real walls. She began clearing the loose rock from a wider section of the cliff base, a natural indentation about 20 feet long and 10 feet deep. This would be the footprint of her home. She hauled stone. From dawn until dusk, she levered, pushed, and carried slabs of granite. Her hands blistered, broke, and bled. The blisters turned to calluses, thick and yellow. Her back felt as if it were permanently locked in a state of burning agony. She learned the physics of leverage, using a stout branch to move rocks twice her weight. She learned to read the grain of the stone, finding the flat, stable pieces for her foundation. She needed mortar. In a small, protected basin below the ridge, she found a deposit of clay, slick and gray. She dug it out with her bare hands, then with a sharpened stick, and hauled it back up the slope in pieces of her torn petticoat. She mixed it with water from a patch of melted snow and packed it between the stones. It was crude, but when it dried, it held. Wall by wall, inch by inch, a structure began to rise. It was a semi-dugout built into the earth, with the sheer granite cliff as its back wall. The fissure was the heart of the design. She built the north wall of her home directly over the smaller section of the crack, leaving an opening near the floor where the warm draft could flow into the room. This was her heat, her secret advantage. The stone walls she was building, thick and solid, would become a thermal mass, absorbing that gentle heat during the day and radiating it back through the long, cold nights. She needed a roof. This was the most daunting task. There were no large trees on the ridge. She had to venture down the slope into the sparse pine forest, her axe in hand. Felling a tree alone was a terrifying, exhilarating experience. The crack of the trunk, the thunderous crash as it fell, it was a sound of power, of creation. But getting the logs back up the slope was a trial of endurance that tested the very limits of her strength. She would cut them into 10-foot lengths, then push, pull, and roll them up the incline, one at a time. It took a week to get enough logs for her roof beams. Placing them was another challenge. She built a ramp of earth and rock, grunting and straining to push the heavy logs into place across the top of her stone walls. She filled the gaps between them with smaller branches, sod, and a thick layer of the same clay she used for mortar. It was ugly, uneven, and utterly beautiful. It was a roof. As she worked deeper into the fissure, clearing away loose rock to create more space, her shovel struck something different. Not the hard ring of granite, but a soft, wet sound. She dug carefully and found it, a slow, steady drip of water seeping from a crack deep within the rock. It was clean, cold,
and constant. A natural spring, protected from the elements, deep inside her mountain. She wept with relief. She now had shelter, warmth, and water. Using her newfound clay, she painstakingly lined a natural hollow in the floor of the fissure, creating a small cistern that could hold 20 gallons of water. It filled slowly, drip by drip, a patient accumulation of life. The excess water trickled down a channel she carved, keeping the air in the deeper parts of the cave humid. This humidity, combined with the constant geothermal warmth, gave her another idea. The floor of the fissure's main chamber was rock, but the soil in the valley was rich and black. The thought was madness, but it took root. She spent another week hauling dirt. She filled her sack, her apron, every container she could fashion, and carried it up the punishing slope. Inside the widest part of the fissure, in the gentle, constant warmth, she built a garden bed, a small plot of impossible, stolen earth. 2 months after arriving, with the first true snows of winter beginning to dust the peaks, Elara stood inside a home. It was a single room, part cave, part cabin. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and clay, but it was hers. She had built it from nothing. That evening, she built her first real fire in the hearth she had constructed, a massive stone fireplace that vented into a separate, smaller fissure she had discovered, which acted as a perfect, invisible chimney. The fire roared to life, and the room filled with a profound, bone-deep warmth. The geothermal draft from the floor, the radiant heat from the hearth, the thick stone walls, it all worked together. She was warm. She was safe. But she was running out of food, and she knew she could not survive a winter on flour paste alone. She needed protein, fat, and a way to replenish her stores. She needed livestock. It was time to return to Promise Creek. Her appearance in town caused a stir. The people of Promise Creek had largely forgotten her, assuming she had either fled east or perished on her worthless rock. To see her walking down the main street, gaunt but upright, her clothes ragged, but her eyes clear and steady, was a shock. She was thinner, harder. Her hands were the calloused, scarred hands of a laborer, not a young widow. Whispers followed her as she walked to Finch's Mercantile. "It's the Graves girl," someone muttered. "The widow." Others used the nickname that had taken root in her absence, the Fissure Witch. They stared at her as if she were a ghost. Mr. Finch looked up from his ledger as she entered, his eyes widening in surprise. He quickly masked it with his usual air of professional disdain. "Well, I'll be," he said, leaning on the counter. "Come back for that ticket east, have you? Should have taken it when you had the chance. Winter's nearly on us." "I need supplies," Elara said, her voice raspy from disuse. She slid a few of her remaining dollars onto the counter. "Salt, 10 pounds, a sack of oats, and I need to buy 2 chickens, laying hens, and a goat." Finch stared at the money, then back at her, a slow, pitying smile spreading across his face. "A goat? Chickens? Up on the fissure? Girl, what are you going to do? Keep them in that crack with you? They'll be frozen solid or eaten by wolves in a week." His laughter was soft, but it filled the quiet store. A few other customers snickered along with him. The foolish girl was even more foolish than they had imagined. "I'll also need some wire and a small bag of turnip seeds," she added, her voice flat, ignoring his mockery. He shook his head, still chuckling, as he gathered her things. The transaction was a public performance of her folly. He sold her the oldest, toughest goat from the pen behind the store, a pregnant nanny nobody else wanted, and 2 scrawny hens. Leading the bleating goat on a rope, with the chickens squawking in a crate strapped to her back, Elara walked out of the store and back through the town. The sight of her, this strange, wild-looking girl leading her pathetic menagerie toward the barren North Ridge, cemented her status as a local eccentric, a cautionary tale. It was the last time she would see Promise Creek for a long, long time. The journey back up the mountain with the animals was slow and difficult. The goat was stubborn, and the chickens complained loudly. But as she climbed, she felt not shame, but a grim sense of purpose. These animals were not a foolish whim. They were a crucial part of her system. They were life. During her weeks of labor, she had not been entirely alone. A few days into her work on the walls, a dog had appeared at the edge of her worksite. He was a scruffy, yellow-furred creature with one floppy ear and intelligent, wary eyes. He was thin, clearly a stray, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity. He did not beg or whine, but simply watched her from a distance. One evening, as she cooked her meager meal, she had tossed him a piece of her flatbread. He had snatched it from the air and devoured it, then settled down by the edge of the firelight, his watchfulness softening into a kind of companionship. She named him Jasper. He became her shadow, her silent partner in the immense task of survival. He guarded the site while she worked, his low growl alerting her to the presence of a curious deer or a passing coyote. At night, he slept at the entrance of her crude shelter, a warm, living barrier against the darkness. Now, as she led the goat up the final stretch of the trail, Jasper trotted ahead, scouting the path. His presence was a comfort, a steady beat of loyalty in the vast, empty wilderness. When she finally reached her home, he greeted the new animals with a curious sniff and a low wag of his tail, seeming to understand that they were now part of their small, strange family. She had already prepared a place for them. Inside the main room, against the back wall, where the geothermal warmth was most constant, she had built a small pen from scrap wood and wire. It was here she settled the chickens and the goat. They would live inside with her, their body heat adding to the warmth of the room, their lives protected from the predators and the cold. She had built a home not just for herself, but for an entire ecosystem in miniature. As autumn deepened, the mockery from the town faded into the background, replaced by the pressing reality of the coming winter. Ilara's life shrank to a series of relentless, vital routines. Each day was a testament to the systems she had built. The first task, always, was the fire. She would rise in the near darkness, the air in the room cool but never freezing, thanks to the constant breath of the fisher. She would add logs to the embers in the great stone hearth, and the fire would roar back to life, its light and heat pushing back the gloom. The stone of the fireplace and the walls around it would drink in the heat, holding it long after the flames died down. Next came the animals. She would milk the goat, her hands working deftly, the warm, frothing milk hissing into a wooden bucket. The milk was life. It was fat and protein. She drank some and saved the rest, learning to make a simple, soft cheese that would keep for weeks. She would feed the chickens a handful of oats, and they would reward her with an egg, sometimes two, each one a perfect, precious miracle. Then she would tend her hidden garden. Down in the fissure, in the humid, perpetually temperate air, her turnip seeds had sprouted. A small patch of impossible green flourished in the subterranean twilight. The sight of it filled her with a quiet, fierce pride. It was a secret defiance of the seasons, a garden grown in the heart of a rock. Her days were filled with the labor of maintenance. She checked the chinking in her walls, patching any cracks with fresh clay. She cleared the snow from her roof, not because she feared its weight, the log beams were thick, but to prevent meltwater from seeping in. She spent hours cutting and splitting firewood, adding to the enormous stack she had piled against the driest wall of her home. The rhythmic thud of her axe was the only sound for miles. The world outside her stone walls became an abstraction. Snow began to fall, at first in gentle flurries, then in thick, heavy blankets. The wind howled,
but inside there was only the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of the animals. She was utterly alone, a solitary queen in a kingdom of stone and warmth. Jasper was her only courtier, a constant, reassuring presence at her feet. She was not lonely. Her world was full, with the demands of the fire, the needs of her animals, the steady pulse of her own survival. Before the deep winter sealed her in completely, her systems faced their first true test. A pack of wolves, driven by hunger from the high peaks, caught the scent of her goat. One night she was jolted awake by Jasper's furious barking. She grabbed her axe and peered through a small crack in her heavy wooden door. In the moonlight she could see them. 5 lean, gray shapes circling her home, their eyes glowing like embers. They clawed at the stone walls, searching for a way in. One leaped onto the low roof, sniffing and digging at the sod. Terror, cold and sharp, seized her, but her walls held, her roof held. The door, made of 2 thick layers of pine, did not splinter. They were a force of nature, but she was inside a fortress of nature. After an hour of fruitless assault, the pack moved on, their howls fading into the distance. She leaned against the cold stone, her heart pounding. It worked. Her shelter was strong. Mr. Graves heard about the wolves from a trapper who had crossed the ridge. The trapper, a man named Brant, had seen the tracks and laughed. "That Fisher witch won't last much longer," Brant had reported back in town. "Wolves got her scent. If they don't get her, the cold will." Graves had merely grunted, a flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, in his cold eyes. He had put her out of his mind, a problem solved, a brief shame erased from his family's history. He, like the rest of Promise Creek, was preparing for winter the way they always had, with stacked cords of wood, pantries full of preserves, and a sturdy roof overhead. They believed in plank walls and iron stoves, in the proven ways of their fathers. They had no idea that the winter bearing down on them was not like the others. It was a monster, and their proven ways were about to be broken. The storm arrived in the second week of December. It did not come like other storms, with a gradual darkening of the sky and a gentle herald of snow. It came like a hammer blow. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow, and the wind, which had been a constant moan for days, suddenly fell silent. An eerie, profound stillness settled over the landscape. Even Jasper seemed to hold his breath, a low whine in his throat. Then the world went white. The blizzard of '83, as it would later be called, was a living entity. It was a screaming, clawing beast of wind and ice. It did not just snow. It fired horizontal blasts of frozen particles that scoured the landscape bare in one place and buried it 10 feet deep in another. The temperature plummeted to a level no one in Promise Creek had ever experienced. Inside her fortress of stone, Elara felt the change. The wind shrieked against her walls, a sound like 1,000 tortured souls. But the stone did not yield. It absorbed the fury, its sheer mass unmoved. Snow piled up against the walls and over the roof, burying her home completely. But instead of crushing her, the snow became a blessing. It was the final layer of insulation, a thick white blanket that sealed her off from the storm's rage. The world outside ceased to exist. Her reality shrank to the single, warm, firelit room. The geothermal draft from the fissure kept the floor from freezing. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn up the natural chimney with a powerful draft. The air was warm and still. Her goat and chickens shifted peacefully in their pen. Her secret garden, deep in the earth, was utterly untouched. She was not fighting the storm. She was beneath its notice, nestled in the warm heart of the mountain. In Promise Creek, it was a different story.
The town was being dismantled. The wind, a force of impossible strength, found every crack in the wooden houses.
It tore shingles from roofs and shattered windows. The snow, heavy and wet, accumulated at an astonishing rate. The roof of the livery stable was the first to go, collapsing with a sound like thunder, killing half the horses inside. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the gaps in their walls, feeding their iron stoves with a desperate hunger. But the cold was a thief, stealing the heat almost as soon as it was made. Firewood, stacked neatly in woodsheds, became inaccessible, buried under mountainous drifts of snow. People began burning their furniture to stay alive. Mr. Finch's mercantile, the symbol of the town's prosperity, was breached. The great glass window at the front exploded inward, and the storm entered, burying his precious goods in a deep, white tomb. Mr. Graves, in his grand ranch house, found that even his wealth was no defense. The wind cracked the great stone chimney of his hearth, filling the house with smoke and forcing him to let the main fire die. His cattle, caught in the open, froze where they stood, becoming grotesque statues of ice. The community's confidence, their faith in their own strength and preparedness, shattered like frozen glass. They were trapped, and they were dying. On the third day of the storm, a sound broke through the rhythmic peace of Ilara's shelter. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Jasper erupted in a volley of sharp, urgent barks. Ilara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. She grabbed her axe and moved to the heavy door, pressing her ear against the wood. A voice, thin and shredded by the wind, cried out, "Please, help me. My son, he's sick." Ilara pulled back the heavy bar that locked the door and heaved it open just a crack. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, fell inward, collapsing onto the floor. It was a woman. As the snow fell away from her face, Ilara recognized her. It was Mary Finch, the wife of the mercantile owner who had laughed at her. She was half frozen, her face a mask of terror and exhaustion. "How?" she stammered, her eyes wide as she took in the impossible scene before her. The warmth, the light, the calm animals. "A trapper. He said he saw smoke from your chimney, but everything is buried." "My son," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "He has the fever. Our house. It is so cold. The fire is out. He will not survive the night. Please." Ilara looked at the desperate woman on her floor. She remembered the smug look on her husband's face, the sound of his laughter. She remembered the whispers, the mockery. A bitter, cold anger flared inside her. It would be justice to turn her away, to let them suffer the consequences of their own arrogance. She could close the door and be safe. Her resources were carefully rationed. The firewood, the food, the milk, they were meant for her survival. Helping this woman, helping the town, would put her own life at risk. But then she looked at Mary Finch's face, no longer a mocker, but a terrified mother. She saw not the town that had cast her out, but a human being in desperate need. The choice was stark. She could cling to her bitterness, or she could act from the strength she had built. Her survival had been for a purpose, and perhaps this was it. The moral core of her, forged in solitude and labor, would not allow her to refuse. "Bring him here," Ilara said, her voice steady. The decision was made. Mary shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I cannot carry him. He is too weak. And my husband, he is trying to keep our daughter from freezing." Ilara did not hesitate. The rescue was not a matter of charity. It was an act of will. She moved with the efficiency she had learned over the past months. She pulled on the thickest hide coat she had fashioned, wrapped her face in wool, and grabbed a coil of rope.
She loaded a small sled she had built for hauling firewood with a bundle of split logs, a sealed pail of goat's milk, several blocks of her simple cheese, and a thick, oiled canvas tarp. "Jasper," she commanded. The dog was at her side instantly, his body tense, his intelligent eyes fixed on her face. She tied one end of the rope to the sled and the other around Jasper's powerful chest. She would follow the dog. His senses were far better than hers in the blinding chaos of the storm. She turned to Mary Finch. "Stay here, by the fire. There is broth in the pot." Stepping out into the blizzard was like stepping into another world. The force of the wind knocked her back, and the cold was a physical shock, a pain that went straight to the bone. The world was a churning vortex of white. Visibility was zero. But Jasper, head down, pulled against the rope, his sense of direction unerring. Elara followed, her hand on the sled, her body bent against the gale. The journey down the mountain, which had taken her hours to climb, was a terrifying, disorienting ordeal. The storm fought her every step, trying to rip the sled from her grasp, trying to freeze the breath in her lungs. It was a journey through a frozen hell. When they finally reached the outskirts of Promise Creek, the scene was one of utter devastation. The town was almost gone, buried under monstrous drifts. Only the peaks of a few roofs were visible. Jasper led her to the Finch's house. Elara had to dig her way down to the door, which was blocked by a solid wall of snow. Inside, the cold was almost as bad as it was outside. Mr. Finch was huddled in a corner with his young daughter, both wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces blue with cold. On a bed, his son lay terrifyingly still, his breathing shallow. Mr. Finch looked up as Elara entered, his face a mixture of shock, shame, and disbelief. This girl, this foolish girl he had mocked, had come through the heart of the apocalypse to save him. Without a word, Elara went to work. She cleared the stove, used a few of her precious logs to start a small, efficient fire, and heated the goat's milk. She forced the warm milk, drop by drop, between the boy's lips. She wrapped him in the warm canvas tarp. She left the rest of the food and firewood on the floor. "Keep the fire small," she said, her voice flat and commanding. "It will last longer." Mr. Finch could only stare, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as she turned and disappeared back into the storm, a ghost of resilience returning to her mountain fortress. After the blizzard finally broke, a full day later, a stunned and broken community emerged into a changed world. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible white, beautiful and deadly. The toll was devastating. More than a dozen people had frozen to death in their homes. Most of the town's livestock was gone. But the Finches were alive. Their story, told in hushed, awestruck tones by Mr. Finch himself, spread through the ragged survivors. The story of the Fissure Witch who had walked through the storm, bringing fire and food. It was a story that made no sense. They had all assumed she was the first to die. A small party of the town's strongest remaining men was formed, led by Mr. Finch and a grim-faced Mr. Graves, whose own grand house was now a frozen shell. Their purpose was twofold: a rescue mission, on the faint hope she was still alive, and a pilgrimage of disbelief. They had to see for themselves. The journey to the ridge was arduous. They waded through chest-deep snow, their progress painfully slow. As they neared the location of the fissure, they saw nothing. The entire cliff face was a smooth, white wave of snow. There was no sign of a home, no sign of life. "We're too late," one of the men said, his voice heavy. But then Finch pointed. "Look." A faint, almost invisible wisp was rising from the top of the snowdrift. It was not smoke, it was heat, a shimmer in the frigid air. It was the vent from her chimney. They began to dig.
When they finally uncovered the top of her door and pushed it open, they were met with a wave of warmth that felt like a physical blow. They stumbled inside, one by one, their eyes blinking against the firelight, their frozen faces stinging in the heat. And they stopped, stunned into silence. The scene before them was beyond all comprehension. It was not a squalid cave, but a warm, ordered living space. A steady fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. A goat and several chickens rested peacefully in a clean pen. And in a corner, illuminated by the soft light of a tallow lamp, was a patch of green. Turnip tops and other hardy greens were growing in a bed of dark earth. Growing. In the dead of winter, after the worst storm in memory, Ilara stood by the fire, watching them. She held a cup of steaming broth in her hands. She was not triumphant. She was not angry. Her face was calm, her eyes holding a deep, quiet strength that made them all feel like chastened children. Mr. Graves, the cattle baron, the man who had pronounced her doom, looked around the room. He saw the ingenious use of the fisher's warmth, the clay-lined cistern full of clean water, the neatly stacked firewood, the preserved food on shelves carved from the rock itself. He saw not a hovel, but a masterpiece of survival, an act of creation so profound it defied everything he knew. He looked at the girl he had cast out, this woman who had not only survived his judgment, but had thrived in the face of it, and had then saved the family of the man who mocked her. The arrogance that had defined his entire life cracked. He took a step forward, his hat in his hands. His voice, when he spoke, was a hoarse whisper. "We were wrong," he said, the words costing him more than all the cattle he had lost. "My God, we called you a fool. We were the fools." Mr. Finch, his face streaked with tears, could only nod. "She saved my boy," he choked out. "She saved us all." Ilara's response was not to gloat or to demand an apology. Her victory was not in their shame, but in her own quiet existence. She simply gestured with her cup toward the pot bubbling over the fire. "There is food," she said. "Eat. You must be cold." Her grace was more stunning than the storm, more powerful than the stone walls she had built. It was the final, unassailable proof of her strength. In the weeks and months that followed, the relationship between Ilara and Promise Creek was irrevocably transformed. The survivors of the blizzard, humbled and broken, did not look to the ridge with scorn, but with a kind of reverence. They came not to mock, but to learn. Mr. Finch was the first, making the arduous trip to trade precious nails and canvas for Ilara's cheese and her knowledge. He asked her how. How had she known? She explained, in her simple, direct way, about the warm breath of the earth, about thermal mass, about building with the land instead of against it. The story of what she had built, and how it had held fast when everything else broke, spread through the valley. The nickname Fissure Witch was retired, replaced by something spoken with quiet respect: the woman on the ridge. Mr. Graves never returned to his grand ranch house. It stood as a hollow monument to a failed way of thinking. He moved into a smaller home in the slowly rebuilding town, a diminished figure. He sent word to Ilara once, offering to sign over the deeds to 100 acres of his best pasture land. Her reply, carried back by a chastened Mr. Finch, was simple. "This land is mine," she had said, and it was clear she was not just talking about the deed, but about the life she had forged from the rock itself. Her methods began to change the valley. When new homes were built, they were not the flimsy wooden boxes of before. People began to build like her, digging into hillsides, using stone and earth, seeking out the land's natural advantages. The settlement of Promise Creek, reborn from the crucible of the Great Blizzard, was rebuilt on a foundation of her quiet, hard-won wisdom. Her shelter became a landmark, a place travelers were taken to see, a testament to what one person could endure and create. Ilara never sought a place in the community. She remained on her ridge, in the home she had bled for. But she was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of the valley, its quiet, unshakable center. Her legacy was not written in a will or carved on a headstone. It was written in the stone walls of the new Promise Creek. It lived in the warmth of homes that now respected the power of the earth. And it shone in the enduring truth that what one generation deems worthless, another, through courage and ingenuity, can transform into the very cornerstone of survival. Her life was a testament not to what she had been given, but to what she had built from what was thrown away.